Meanwhile, paralleling Teasel's misadventures of the long night, Rambo's had one of his own, and wakes to find that he had collapsed inside a mine. He thought it was a cave. He goes through a loss of time temporarily, thinking he has lost his sight and gone blind from damage done to his eyes from the brambles or whatever, and till he gets out of the entrance, viewing the line of police and enforcement officers in the distance prepping to hunt him, and he's in great pain and his ribs are pretty mashed up, and he has developed jungle fever, in pitch from his adventures on the lam so far. Realizing he must form a plan of his own and stand here for the moment, he decides to make a fire in the mine and rest a bit before continuing his escape. He has to make a couple of trips. He has some match problem with the fire. He's kind of stumbly. He's not the full force Rambo he was. He's been very, very depleted, and it's hard for him. And we can see he's not all there in his preparations, and he's pretty beaten down. And in an attempt to rid himself of the fever, he collects some fir boughs from different spots near the mine to remain undetected by passers-by. He knows he has to eat and regain energy because he's super disoriented. And there's a little bit like the scuffle I was talking about earlier with the hunters and the police officer who got shot in the head. Below him, off in the distance, there's a little, during that scuffle, he decides to mask a gunshot among the posse off in the distance, and he kills an owl. Then repairs his fire deep in the mine to get warm and to eat, the offal, planning to slip right through that line below in the distance in a new escape plan once he fully recovers from his current state, I should say. He thinks back to childhood, hiking solo in the mountains, finding a cave drawing of a buffalo in one of the caves, and spending time there, and even back to his abusive alcoholic father, who had repeatedly beat him in the face for not saying where he was or what he was out doing. So, he then starts thinking of the old cave and this mine as a church. And there's a trippy part where he plays out a confession scenario in the dark, and we start to see him becoming more and more careless, forgetting to close off the entrance with the branches and checking the mine for bears or snakes. So he fights himself a bit, and there's some reflection on sin and what's right and what's wrong, and he goes on prepping, his owl, smoothly ruffling its or smoothing out its ruffled feathers, admiring it, then plucks it, disembowels it, spits it over a fire, and finishes it off, preparing a plan, watching the lights below. He starts, he eats it while he comes out of the cave, and he eats it while he's looking down at the preparations below for his capture. And he wishes for salt and pepper. And, eventually the fever kicks in harder. A chopper flies overhead, and Rambo sets his sight on the army off far below. So, excuse me, sorry. Come morning, we find him watching the approaching army from high in the hills, and he hurries down toward them in hopes to go, right through them. So he uses the early morning mountain mist kind of for cover. Then he gets in the stream, and he moves up within it to where there are lots of tree roots, and this is my second favorite part of the book. And I wonder if they referenced this straight out of, referenced this straight out of the book for that amazing scene in First Blood Part 2. You'll know which one I'm talking about in a second. But get this shit. He burrows himself embedded in the ground, camouflaged in mud and earth and roots, and buries himself down, like right in there with like just a tiny maybe like a twig space or the space of a leaf popping out of the ground rolled up, to breathe through. And he decides he's gonna wait for the posse to walk right over him. And there's a long time, it's a really long scene, and he's, almost passing out from asphyxiation, and there's lots of paranoia, and he gets his ribs and upper body even crushed by stomping troops overhead, who eventually do cover the ground above him. Like, they come in and they kind of actually stand on him for a little while, not knowing he's there, and then move on. It's a brilliant little scene. And so later, almost fails, he almost fails to get out. Like, he has a near-death experience. It's really tense and crazy, and how he erases his path in and out of there. It's just a wicked scene. And he kind of for a moment he flashes back to being a kid playing under a sandhill and almost being killed when it had collapsed in on him. So he's down there almost an hour in that whole scene, and the events sequence, it's just an insane sequence. Sorry, it's wicked. And there's some cool premonition stuff in this section. And, he fights himself on his brief feeling of freedom when he finally does emerge from the mud. And, as far as going to talk to himself, saying, you'll have enough time to rest if they catch you. So he's going to continue on now. So he cleans up in the stream and uses a tree branch to clean his gun, his rifle. And it's almost like he's rejuvenating, and hears 2 packs of dogs off in the distance. So he forms and executes, using an old Indian method, a plan to fuck up the dog's trail. He's wounded, so he knows he can't outrun 2 packs of dogs or stand and fight them. So after leaving again, he falls upon a man washing in the water. And Rambo jumps at him, knife out, stabbing him, bam, in the stomach, and guts the man upward through the ribcage, dead. So the guy's buddy comes out of the brush after taking a leak and freaks the fuck out. And he draws on Rambo. He fires, he misses Rambo. But, Rambo fires back in time. And it's really hair-raising scene. And he just explodes that man's head everywhere. So the jig is up and the chase is back on because everybody hears us, and they come a running, and the kill count hits 23. So Rambo retreats back to the mine, bullets blazing overhead everywhere. He's running, and he ends up collapsing the entrance, sealing himself inside the mine, placing a blocking barrier, and it's fucking crazy. Meanwhile, Teasel's thinking more like Rambo now. And the trio of himself with Kern and Troutman go over tactics for their pursuit. And they're notified of Rambo's trap position. So, Teasel accepts any future punishment if this plan to take Rambo down has a bad turn. And he almost has a heart attack from over-medicating. And meanwhile, back at the mine behind the barrier, through a punch hole size hole to the overeager weekend warriors outside the mine, Rambo and the guys outside begin to converse. And Rambo agrees to turn himself in, but only if Teasel comes out to get him. And he almost tosses his weapons out through the hole when they inform him that Teasel is not coming. So Rambo feels the air change within the mine and figures there's another exit. In kind of like a fuck you moment, because he's offering to give it all up and do whatever they want and give in to whatever they want. And they don't even have the decency to meet him halfway. So he recollects his weapons and preps them and escapes down into the earth of the mine. What follows is a long-ass nightmare of a segment, through self-enlightenment and torture. And he fashions a quick torch using the fur boughs and stuff, and he uses the air and smoke to locate the way out. Meanwhile, Teasel and Troutman have a deep heart-to-heart. Kern comes in and Teasel starts losing it pretty much, and eventually collapses and passes out. So we cut back to Rambo, who has become completely lost deep within the mine. He falls down a ladder. Eventually his flame runs out, and we are in complete darkness for a long stretch of the act. He uses a cartridge and tosses it, outward to judge distance and for holes and for checking, because he could fall in anywhere, and surrounding bearings and stuff. So he crawls painfully into a hole and begins crawling through some crunchy slime, some awfully smelling stuff. And he gets almost waist deep into it, and he realizes it's bat guano and flesh-eating beetles. So he freaks out. Bats start flooding him like crazy. He crawls back out, almost falling off a high ledge of rock to water below and certain death. Contemplating waiting for death or to be captured, he has a moment with a dead, decayed, ugly-ass, busted-up miner body that had been lost down there or poisoned. And, he falls asleep and wakes up, and he eventually decides to crawl back through to follow the air trail out, almost drowning in bat shit. He's like bathed, and his genitals are all like, he's like freaking out because his genitals are all like mushing with the bat shit, and he's covered in beetles and bats, and he fears rabies. There's bats in his hair and in his clothes, and he's going batshit crazy. Eventually following the fleeting bats to an exit.